So I have this complex when it comes to how I rate. I've discussed it on my channel more than once. Here's a video if you want to hear me discuss it even more. But basically, I have a really hard time figuring out ratings for books sometimes because I don't know if I should rate with thoughts towards the people that are reading and watching my reviews or with thoughts towards the authors, because I think both are affected. If I rate a book low just because I didn't like it, not because the book was bad, that affects the author. It affects the overall rating of the book. I don't think it's fair to the book, and I don't think it's fair to the author. So I have a really hard time rating a book 1, 2, or even 3 stars just because it wasn't my cup of tea. But I also have a hard time rating a book high when I think that it's objectively good. I just didn't like it. Because that affects people that trust my reviews and look toward them, people who have similar taste to me, and they're like, oh, I like the same things Murphy does. Whoa, Murphy rated this 4 stars. I should pick it up too. But in actuality, I didn't like it 4 stars worth. We've had this discussion. I don't need to be so repetitive. I struggle with my ratings when I pick up a book that objectively isn't for me, but also isn't bad. So I have a whole list of books that I've either rated too high or too low based on my preferences because of this conundrum that I face, trying to be fair to the author while also trying to reflect my personal taste. This video is about books that I've rated too high, which means that I gave them a higher rating because I do think that they are objectively good. I just didn't like them as well as my rating indicates. We're going to start with what's going to be the most controversial book in the video, because why not? And that's A Game of Thrones, or The Game of Thrones. Whatever I say is wrong, always. I do have a full review for this book. If you want to check it out, it'll be linked in the corner as well as in the description of this video. But essentially, I gave this book 4 stars, kind of a 3.5, 3.75, but I rated it 4 on Goodreads because I get it. The world building is phenomenal in this book. The characters are well built and established, and I see so much potential in where they could go. The story itself in book 1 was pretty interesting. I've never watched the show. I've never watched a single episode of the show. So I didn't go in already knowing the characters, already knowing the world, already having an idea of the plot. I really experienced everything completely for the first time through this book. And I know a lot of people said that their enjoyment of the book was enhanced because they already loved it going in because of the show. And then a ton of people read the books first and still loved it. So I'm not like, I get it. I personally don't like Martin's writing style. I have rants about it in other videos. There are other authors whose writing style aren't my favorite. Like, for instance, Robert Jordan isn't my favorite writing style. He is relatively similar to Martin in the extreme descriptions and very repetitive descriptions, but I dislike Martin's writing style more, and I also struggled with the story to an extent, so it just kind of was a double whammy for me. The thing is that I see so much that Martin did right in these books, and I see so much potential for the series as a whole. I did read maybe a quarter of book 2, and then I quit it because I just accepted that I'm not going to enjoy the series right now. I do plan on trying the series again eventually in the future. It's just not a priority for me at all at the moment. But I think one thing that Martin helped me realize is that I just don't think I like grimdark fantasy, which people argue all the time if Game of Thrones falls into the grimdark category or not. It doesn't really matter for the purpose of this video. The point is, I love books that get dark and gritty and intense, but I've found that I have a limit, and Martin exceeds that limit. And I don't know well enough to be able to draw a line in the sand and say, here's my limit, here's where I stop. But there is a point where things get so extremely dark and so extremely descriptive and non-stop and non-halt into the dark descriptions and gratuitous acts happening page after page after page, that it gets to where I stop enjoying myself anymore. Again, I still don't know where that line is because I do really like books that go quite dark, but at some point I lose my enjoyment, and with with A Game of Thrones, I was enjoying it a lot until about the halfway point, and then I kind of hit my limit with this book, and I stopped enjoying it because it was just too much for me. I get why people love it so much. It makes sense to me. I just don't really think it's for me, at least not at this point. Maybe I'll try it again later. Maybe I'll be able to love the story despite the things that I don't like as much, which is pretty much just, I don't like Martin's writing style, and it's too much for me. Next, let's go into An Unkindness of Magicians, which I actually have a copy of, so save myself some time in editing. An Unkindness of Magicians. So this is a book that I have praised a lot on my channel. It was originally published as a standalone fantasy, but she's now announced that it'll have a sequel, which I will be reading. So this is about, oh man, it's been a minute since I've read it. Okay, so this is about it's low fantasy. It takes place in London, but there is a world, there's a magical and unseen world that happens amongst the magicians that mortals can't see. It is comprised of houses of magical families, people who have their loyalties tied to a certain house, and every, I want to say 30 years, there is a magical tournament that happens where the heads of the houses, the leaders of the houses, the representatives of the houses face off and have gruesome battles to determine who's going to be the leader for the next 30 years. And these people, they set the laws, they can do anything pretty much, so you really want to be that top dog. The story kicks off when Sydney, our protagonist, shows up out of nowhere. Ain't nobody knows where she comes from, who she is, but she's in it to win it for some pretty vengeful reasons. I know the synopsis kind of sounds a tiny bit like Harry Potter, and a lot of people do call this the adult Harry Potter book, which do with that what you want, but I loved this book. It got much darker than I had initially gone in expecting. It was very emotional. I was very attached to Sydney. I was very attached to a lot of the side characters. The story was just so good. The reason I say I rated it too high is because it is a 5-star book on my Goodreads, and I've read it twice, and I loved it both times, and I know if I read it a third time, I will love it again. But it's not perfect. Primarily the ending is where I kind of am bummed out, because the book went dark the entire way through, and then the ending, it had some of the consequences that I wish for when you have a book that has high stakes. I want high consequences, and it definitely had them, but a little bit anticlimactic, which was a bumski. Wow, I'm spending a lot of time on these. I should probably pick it up. Eleanor Oliphant is perfectly fine. This is a situation where I just didn't enjoy it as much, but it's not because the book itself was bad, it just wasn't my taste. This is one of those books where you follow a person as she has an inner journey and sorts through her life and comes to terms with things. It's a book that focuses on her obsessive qualities, her anxiety, and her social skills that are affected by those two things. She just goes through this tremendous inner healing throughout this book, which is wonderful. But it's one of those books where you could swap out literally any detail within the plot and within the side characters, swap it out with anything else, and the point of the book would stay the same. The point of the book isn't anything but her inner journey, which is great, but it's not usually my thing. So I enjoyed it about 2 stars worth. I gave it, I think, 3 stars, because it's another one of those things where it's like, I don't think the book or the author deserve a 2-star, but I also don't want to be misleading about how I felt about it. It's one of those conundrums. The Bear in the Nightingale, which I talked about in another video that I literally just filmed. I don't know which of these videos is going up first, so I'll try to be quick. This was written by a US author who is in love with Russian folklore and mythology, and this book, in my opinion, is essentially a love letter to Russian folklore. So it's a very environmental book. It leans heavily on Russian mythology and on building up a culture within that mythology and that folklore. And the plot isn't really important in this book at all. There's basically a promise of the plot at the beginning of the story, and then every now and then the same character pops back in to say, hey, remember that plot I promised you? it's coming, just not right now. And then he leaves, and then he does it again and again and again until finally we get the plot in the last 50 pages of the book. But that's not the point of the book. The point of the book is the atmosphere. It's an atmospheric book. It's about building that folklore, that culture, that atmosphere. It's just about the feelings involved in the book and not about the plot. And I tend to be a reader where I love world building, I love atmosphere, I love character development, and I also love plot. And if you do all those things apart from the plot, I'm bummed out. And that's how I felt about this book. I gave it, I think 3 stars, 3.5 stars, because I get it. I get the love. But honestly, it was like a 2 or less as far as my enjoyment goes. Arch Enemies. This is a book that I loved. This is a Marissa Meyer book. Marissa Meyer is an author that writes books that I shouldn't like, but because I love the way she writes, it just connects with me. I almost always end up loving them. Renegades and Arch Enemies, they're just, they're books that are hard for me to recommend to my subscribers because y'all know my taste and this doesn't fit into my taste, but I love them. So Arch Enemies was such a middle book. The story didn't progress at all. All that happened was that we built up, we put muscles on the budding romance. That was the whole book, and it was like a 400-page book. Or more, now that I think of it. But the story itself didn't progress at all. We just progressed the romance. But I don't know what to say. I'm not even that invested in this romance, and I tend to not like romance if it's not a romance genre. Like, this is a sci-fi book, so I want sci-fi. But something about Marissa Meyer almost always gets me there, even if the book itself shouldn't. So really, this book is like a 2 or a 3 star as far as what I would consider objective, like you didn't progress anything. But I loved it. I enjoyed it, almost 5 stars worth. So I gave it 4 stars. Is that fair? Who knows? A Grief Observed. This is a nonfiction by C.S. Lewis about him dealing with his grief after his wife passed away. I read this hoping to get more out of it than I did. I kind of thought he was going to be talking about grief in a more objective manner, in a more encompassing, here's what grief feels like, here's what grief is, here's how I worked my way through it. But it was really more about his relationship with his wife and him leaning on his faith, which was good for me. I really enjoyed reading it. I'm glad I read it, and I saw so much of my friend whose wife passed away. I saw so much of him in this book. But for me, who's experienced grief in different ways, I didn't connect with it at all. So I gave it 4 stars because truly it's a 5-star book. I mean, I think that it deserves 5 stars because he was so vulnerable and because I think that it will connect with the right audience. But I just wasn't the right audience. So it was more of a 3-star for me, but I gave it 4 because it really deserved more than 3. Okay, trying to get through these last ones fast. Six of Crows. I also talked about this in a recent book and a recent video, and again, I don't know if that one's coming up first or not, but basically I hated the first 2/3 of this book, would have given it 1 star, but then the last little bit of this book is a 5-star book for me. I ended up giving it, I think, like 3.5 or something like that, and I may have even rounded it up to a 4. Which is for sure too high as far as my enjoyment goes. Now, does it deserve that much? The character building was phenomenal. And the story itself, much like The Bear and the Nightingale, was just a promise of plot until the very end when the plot finally happened. But nothing other than just a promise until then. So once again, if you love really deep character development and you couldn't care less about plot, go for it. But I like both. And this book didn't provide both until the very last little bit, and that was so hard for me. Enjoyment-wise, it's definitely closer to a 3 or a 2.5, but I don't think it actually deserves that if you look at it objectively. Trail of Lightning, which I have a full review for, there's nothing to say about this. It's an adult urban fantasy. I don't read urban fantasy. I gave it 3 stars because I think if you like the genre, it's good. I didn't like it because I don't like the genre, so it got a middle-of-the-road review. And I'm just going to end it there because, quite frankly, I've been talking too long. So let me know if you have any books on this kind of list that you rated higher because you think that the book deserves a higher rating than your enjoyment level merits. We've talked about rating systems a lot on this channel because it's a complexity that I have, because I feel like I want to give the author and the book what they deserve, but I also want to help people who watch and read my reviews to know what I actually feel. It's hard. But I'd love to chat with you more about any of these in the comments. I post videos every Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. I'll see you guys again soon.